The day my son-in-law showed up at my front door with a notary public and a stack of legal papers, I was in the middle of making a grilled cheese sandwich. I remember that detail clearly, not because it's particularly important, but because everything about that afternoon had been ordinary up until the moment it wasn't. I'd had a good morning. I'd taken my dog, a 12-year-old yellow lab named Biscuit, for a slow walk around the block. I'd called my buddy Lloyd from the old job, talked for maybe 40 minutes about nothing: hockey, the price of gas, whether the Leafs were ever going to stop breaking our hearts. I'd come home, fed Biscuit, and started on that sandwich. Then the doorbell rang. His name was Preston, my son-in-law. He'd been married to my daughter Abigail for 4 months at that point. 4 months. The ink was barely dry on the wedding photos that were still sitting in a box in my hallway because I hadn't gotten around to framing them yet. I turned off the burner and went to the door. Preston was standing there in a jacket and tie, which was already strange because I'd never seen that man in a jacket and tie on a weekend. Beside him was a woman I didn't know. 50s, glasses, carrying a leather portfolio. She introduced herself as a notary. She was pleasant about it, professional. That almost made it worse. Preston smiled at me the way he always smiled, that wide, easy smile that I had distrusted from the very first time Abigail brought him home for dinner. He said, "Hey Ted, glad you're home. We've got some paperwork to sort out." I stepped back. I let them in. Not because I didn't have a bad feeling. I did. Immediately. The same way you feel the weather shift before a storm. But because I wanted to hear what he was going to say. I wanted to watch his face while he said it. He sat down at my kitchen table, across from the notary, and he slid a document across to me. It was a transfer of title for this house. My house. The house I'd owned for 22 years. The house where I'd raised Abigail after her mother passed. The house where I'd repainted the bedroom ceiling 3 times because she kept changing her mind about the color. The house I'd paid off 8 years ago, working overtime at the plant every winter to do it. The document had my name on it, and his. Preston said, "Abigail told me you'd already agreed to this. Early inheritance, you said. Keep it in the family." He paused. "She was really touched, Ted. Really." I looked at him for a long moment. "Did she?" I said. "She cried," he said. "You know how she is." I did know how she was. That was exactly the problem. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. My name is Ted Calloway. I'm 61 years old. I live in Guelph, Ontario, and I have spent the better part of my adult life working in manufacturing. Machine parts, mostly, nothing glamorous. I started on the floor and eventually moved into quality oversight. I'm not a rich man, but I'm a careful one. I paid my bills, I saved what I could, I made sure Abigail had what she needed even when it was tight. Her mother, Donna, died when Abigail was 16. Breast cancer, quick and brutal. 1 year from diagnosis to the end. Abigail and I were left with each other, and we figured it out the best we could. 2 people rattling around in a house that suddenly felt 3 times too big. She was a good kid. She still is. Underneath it all, I have to keep reminding myself of that, especially on the days when the anger gets the better of me. She was funny and stubborn, and she used to leave half-eaten bags of chips on every surface in the kitchen, no matter how many times I asked her not to. She got decent grades, went to college in Waterloo for 2 years, ended up in administrative work at a property management company in Hamilton. She called me every Sunday. We had dinner together at least twice a month. Then she met Preston. She met him at a work event. He was in real estate. Not a full agent, something adjacent to it. He was vague about the specifics whenever I asked. And he had a way of presenting himself that I can only describe as extremely polished. He was 38. Abigail was 32 at the time, and from the outside they looked like a good match. He was charming. He remembered details. He'd ask follow-up questions about things I'd mentioned weeks earlier, the kind of thing that makes a person feel heard. He brought wine when he came for dinner. He learned that I liked hockey and started texting me about game scores. But the first time he came over for dinner, the very first time, within 20 minutes of walking through my front door, he asked me how long I'd had the place. Casual question. The kind anyone might ask. 22 years, I told him. He nodded, looked around. Great neighborhood. Property values here must have gone up something significant since then. I said they had. He said smart investment. And then the conversation moved on, and we had pasta, and I opened the wine he'd brought, and I told myself I was being paranoid. But I wasn't. I know that now. I wasn't paranoid at all. Over the next year and a half, Preston integrated himself into our lives the way damp gets into walls, slowly, quietly, until one day you look, and the damage is already done. He moved in with Abigail into her apartment in Hamilton. He started coming to every family occasion. He remembered my birthday. He helped me replace the Eavestro's one October weekend, which I appreciated because that job is miserable and I'm not as young as I used to be. And every so often, in the middle of conversations about other things, he'd make a comment about the house, about how I must be thinking ahead, about retirement planning, about how a lot of older guys he knew, he always said older guys, which I found interesting, had started setting things up early to avoid probate, avoid delays, keep the family from dealing with paperwork grief when the time came. I never gave him a straight answer. I'd change the subject, or say something non-committal. He was smart enough not to push. What he didn't know, what I had not told anyone, was that I'd spoken to a lawyer 11 months after I first met him. Her name was Deborah Young, and she'd been doing estate and property law in Guelph for going on 30 years. I'd been referred to her by my accountant, who is also a careful man and who had noted, without much drama, that it might be worth having a proper structure in place, given that I was a single homeowner with one adult child who was in a new relationship. Deborah was direct in the way that I appreciate. She laid out my options, explained the implications of each, and asked me what I was most worried about. I'm not sure yet, I told her. I just want to make sure nothing can happen without my say-so. She nodded like that made complete sense. We set up a revocable living trust, meaning the house remained technically mine. I could change or dissolve the arrangement at any time, but any transfer of the property required my documented consent under very specific conditions. We also made sure that no power of attorney existed that could be used against me without a formal assessment of my capacity, signed off by 2 independent physicians. Then I did one more thing. I called my daughter. I didn't tell her about the lawyer or the trust. What I told her was that I needed to update my will, that I was planning to leave her the house eventually, but that I wanted it handled properly and legally, and that she should never, under any circumstances, agree to anything involving my property without talking to me first, directly. Not through anyone else. She said, "Of course, Dad," and laughed a little, said I was being morbid, and moved on. I should have been more specific. That's the part I carry with me. Preston proposed to Abigail on a Thursday in October on a trip to Niagara-on-the-Lake. He sent me a text to let me know beforehand, which I suppose was his version of asking permission. Abigail called me an hour after it happened, crying in the best possible way, and I told her I was happy for her because in that moment I genuinely was. I wanted her to be happy. I still want that. The wedding was June. Small ceremony at a vineyard outside of Cambridge. 35 people, nice food, a band that played too loud but got better as the night went on. I danced with Abigail to the song Donna, and I had danced to at our own wedding, 28 years earlier, and I held it together for about 90% of it before I had to look away. Abigail squeezed my hand and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Preston toasted me in his speech. He called me a man of integrity. He said he hoped to learn from my example. 4 months later, he was sitting in my kitchen with a notary and a forged consent document. What Preston had told Abigail, I later found out, was this, that he and I had been talking, that I had brought up the idea myself, that I wanted to see her settled and secure while I was still around to enjoy it, and that I had agreed in principle to transfer the title to both of them as an early inheritance, but that I wanted to keep it quiet and surprise her with it. He told her the paperwork was already in motion. He said I'd specifically asked him to handle the details so she wouldn't have to worry. She believed him. I understand why, even though it still stings. He'd spent 18 months building exactly like credibility. He knew which details to include to make it sound like me. He knew I'd talked about not wanting to leave her with a mess to sort through. He knew I sometimes liked to do things quietly and then present them as a done deal because I'd learned, raising her alone, that anticipation sometimes hurt more than the event itself. He knew how to sound like someone who knew me. What he didn't account for was that I had already spoken to Deborah about exactly this kind of scenario, and that Deborah had, at my request, registered a specific notation with the land registry in Ontario, a flag that would trigger an automatic alert to her office if any transfer attempt was made on the property. Without my live, in-person, verified signature in front of 2 witnesses, nothing was going anywhere. The document he'd brought to my kitchen that afternoon was either a fabrication or a template he intended to have me sign right then and there in front of the notary. I don't know which, and in the end it didn't matter, because I had already made a phone call that morning. I want to be honest about this part. I wasn't certain. I had suspicion and I had preparation, but I wasn't certain until I saw him at the door in that jacket and tie. The moment I saw that, I knew that was his closing outfit. That was how he dressed when he expected to walk out with something. So while they were parking, while I was standing at my stove, watching the cheese start to melt, I called Lloyd. Lloyd is a retired OPP officer. He lives 12 minutes away. He owed me a favor from 17 years ago that we'd never discussed openly, but that we both knew was still on the books. I told him I needed him in my driveway within the next half hour, in his old capacity, and I needed him to have made a call or two before he got there. Then I turned off the burner, went to the door, and let Preston and the notary in. We sat at the table. I looked at the document. I asked the notary a few questions, polite, unhurried questions about her credentials, the origin of the paperwork, who had commissioned it. She answered what she could. Some things she deferred to Preston on, and the more she deferred, the more uncomfortable she became, because I think she had started to sense that something about the afternoon was not adding up. Preston was doing his best to project calm. He kept using my name. It's straightforward, Ted. You already know all of this, Ted. Abigail is so excited, Ted. I let him talk. After about 15 minutes, I heard a car pull into my driveway. Then the front door, which I had left on the latch, opened. Lloyd came in. He wasn't in uniform, because he's been retired for 6 years, but he carried himself the way he always had, which is to say he took up space in a room without trying to. Behind him was a younger man I didn't know, a constable from the Guelph police service, who'd apparently been briefed on the way over. Preston's face changed. It didn't go pale exactly. It went very still, the way a face goes when the person behind it is trying very hard to calculate something with not enough time to do it. Lloyd introduced himself. He explained that there had been a flag on the property title since the previous year. He explained that the specific document Preston had brought today had been reviewed, and that the notary herself might want to consider her own exposure here, because the commissioning information on it did not appear to correspond to any legitimate estate transfer instruction. The notary closed her portfolio. She said very quietly that she would need to make some calls. Then she excused herself and sat at the far end of my couch and stared at her phone. Preston looked at me. Ted, he said, I don't know what you think. I think, I said, that you should have a conversation with Constable. I looked at the young officer. Tran, he said. Constable Tran, I said, before you say anything else to me. Preston said my name one more time, and then he stopped talking. I'm not going to walk through all of the legal proceedings in detail, because, honestly, I don't fully understand all of them, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What I can tell you is that it took about 8 months from start to finish. Preston was charged with fraud over $5,000 and attempted property theft. His lawyer argued that it was all a misunderstanding, that he had genuinely believed I had consented and had simply been trying to facilitate the paperwork on my behalf. The judge was not persuaded by this, partly because the document he'd brought bore a notarial seal number that turned out to belong to an entirely different notary who had no knowledge of the file. Someone had copied it. He received a conditional sentence, house arrest, community service, a substantial fine. I know some people will feel that's not enough. Some days I agree with them. Other days I think about the fact that he is 40 years old and will spend the rest of his career with this on his record in an industry built entirely on trust, and I find that sufficient. The marriage to Abigail was annulled 6 months later. That was her decision. I didn't push her toward it. I told her it was her life and she was an adult, and I would support whatever she decided. But she called me one night in late February, after a long silence in the conversation. and said she didn't know how to be married to someone who had looked at her father's house and seen an opportunity. She said she didn't know how to unknow that. I told her I understood. She moved back to Guelph in March, not back into my house. She rented a place on the east side, a one-bedroom above a used bookshop on Wyndham, which suits her. She came for dinner that first Sunday, and we sat in my kitchen with takeout Thai food, and at some point she said, very quietly, "I should have called you." When he told me, I should have picked up the phone. "Yeah," I said. "You should have." She looked at the table, I said, "But you didn't know what you were dealing with." "I barely knew, and I was looking." That's the truest thing I can say about all of it. These people, the Prestons of the world, they don't announce themselves. They're patient, and they're observant, and they find the gaps in a family, and they stand in them until you think they belong there. What I want to say to anyone watching this who has a parent getting older, or who is that parent getting older, talk to each other. Not once, not in vague terms over the phone, but specifically, clearly, about the house, about the will, about who can make decisions and under what conditions. It is not morbid to have that conversation. It is an act of love. Donna and I never had it, because we were both too young and too stupid, and we thought we had time. And when she died, there were things that took months to untangle, that we could have resolved in an afternoon if we'd just sat down and talked. I had a lawyer, because my accountant suggested it at the right moment, and I happened to listen. That's not a plan, that's luck, dressed up as preparation. You shouldn't need luck. You should know exactly what you have, who can touch it, and under what circumstances. And you should be suspicious, not ashamed to be suspicious, when a new person in your family's life asks about your assets within 20 minutes of meeting you. That's not paranoia. That's paying attention. Biscuit is still with me, slower than ever, mostly interested in the patch of sun at the end of my hallway, and whatever I happen to be cooking. He's 12 now, which is old for a lab, and the vet says we're in the bonus rounds. I take him out every morning, same route, same pace as him, which is slow. I finished that grilled cheese, by the way. After Lloyd and Constable Tran left, after Preston had been taken for questioning, and the notary had given her statement, and my kitchen had gone quiet again, I went back to the stove, turned the burner on, and finished making my lunch. I sat at the table where Preston had sat, with his leather portfolio, and his forged documents, and his $300 jacket, and I ate my sandwich and gave Biscuit a corner of it, and I looked around my kitchen, my counters, my window, my 22 years of small repairs and cold winters and Sunday mornings, and I thought, not today, and not ever, if I have anything to say about it.